girlfriend Emily and I were driving to my parents' house for Christmas, a solid 6-hour trip through mostly rural highways. It was supposed to be an easy drive, just us, a few podcasts, and a thermos of coffee to get us through. But the weather had other plans. And about 3 hours into the trip, the snow started coming down hard. At first it was manageable. The roads were wet but drivable, and I slowed down to be safe. Emily kept checking her phone for weather updates, but there wasn't much to do other than just push through. Then the wind picked up, blowing snow across the road in thick white sheets. Visibility went to hell. I could barely see the taillights of the car ahead of us before it disappeared entirely. "We should pull over," Emily said. Her voice was nervous. I agreed. There was no point in risking it. A rest stop sign popped up just in time, only 2 miles ahead. I crept along until we found the turnout. It wasn't much, just a small parking lot and a boarded-up building that might have been a diner once. A single street lamp buzzed weakly, casting long shadows over the snow-covered pavement. I parked as close to the light as possible and left the engine running for warmth. Emily leaned forward, peering into the storm outside. "Do you think we should wait it out or turn back?" she asked. "Let's give it a bit," I said. "Maybe it'll ease up." We sat there for a while, listening to the wind batter the car. The storm was not letting up. If anything, it was getting worse. I was about to suggest that we head back when I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. A man was walking towards us from the far end of the lot, his figure barely visible through the swirling snow. "Do you see that?" I asked, my stomach tightening. Emily nodded, her hand instinctively going to the door lock. The man approached the driver's side window, his face coming into view. He was middle-aged, wearing a heavy coat and a knit cap pulled down. He did not look like a drifter. His clothes were clean, and he did not seem homeless, but there was something off about him. His smile did not reach his eyes, and I cracked the window just enough to talk. "Hey, can I help you?" "Car trouble?" he asked, his voice oddly cheerful for someone standing in a blizzard. "Nah, we're good," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral, just waiting for the weather to clear. He did not move. His eyes flickered to Emily in the passenger seat, then back to me. "Your girl looks cold," he said. "Bet she'd like a nice warm place to wait. There's a cabin not too far from here." "We're fine," I said, a little sharper this time. I started to roll the window up, but his hand shot out, pressing against the glass. My heart rate spiked. "You know," he said slowly, his eyes fixed on Emily now. "I was just thinking, if you weren't here, I wonder what she'd do. What she'd let me do." Emily stiffened beside me, her breath hitching. I felt a surge of adrenaline and anger, but before I could respond, he leaned closer, his face almost touching the glass. "I could take care of you, you know, real quick. Then we'd find out." "Get away from the car," I said, my voice shaking despite my best effort. My foot hovered over the gas pedal, but the snow under the tires had me worried that we'd just spin out. He did not move. His grin widened, and for a second, I thought he was about to try something. Then, almost miraculously, the car shifted slightly forward. The tires caught. I hit the gas harder, and we lurched ahead. The man stepped back, his expression shifting to something darker, angrier. Emily screamed, "Go, go, go," as I floored it, the car fishtailing but finally gaining traction. We did not stop driving until we reached a gas station about 20 miles down the road. Both of us were shaking, and it was not from the cold. Emily wanted to call the police, but what would we even say? The guy didn't actually do anything, technically, but his words, the way he looked at her, I've never been so scared in my life. We made it to my parents' house later that night, but the trip did not feel the same after that. And I couldn't shake the feeling that if the snow had just been a little worse, if we hadn't been able to drive away, things could have ended very differently. It happened when I was 8, on a snow day from school. A blizzard had shut everything down, so I spent the morning doing what any kid would, playing outside. My parents let me have the front yard to myself since it was right in view from the living room window. I was bundled up in layers, making a snowman with the sticky, packable snow that blanketed everything. I just finished stacking the last ball when I saw him. A man standing on the sidewalk, watching me. He was not anyone I recognized, which was weird, because our neighborhood was tight-knit. He had a scruffy beard, a dark coat, and one of those knit hats with the tassels on the side. "Nice snowman," he said, stepping off the sidewalk and into the yard. "You're pretty good at that." I remember mumbling a quiet thanks, trying not to make eye contact. I wasn't scared at first, but there was something about the way he moved, too casually, like he belonged there even though I know he didn't. He walked closer, hands in his coat pockets, and nodded toward the snowman. "You know what's missing?" I shrugged. "A carrot nose. Every snowman needs a carrot." I told him I did not have any carrots, figuring that he'd just move on. Instead, he smiled and said, "That's okay. I've got plenty at my house. Come with me and we'll grab some." That's when the unease really hit me. I took a step back, trying to put some distance between us, but he stepped forward, closing the gap. We were so close I could smell his breath, like stale coffee and something sour. "No thank you," I said. "Oh, come on," he insisted, his tone playful but off. "It'll only take a minute. Your snowman deserves a proper nose." Every instinct I had screamed at me that something wasn't right. I shook my head again, but he did not move. His hands were still in his pockets, and his body was angled just enough to block my path to the front door. That's when I heard my dad. "Hey," he shouted from the doorway. His voice cut through the wind like a knife. "Get the hell away from my son." The man's face changed in an instant. The smile disappeared, replaced by something cold and angry. Without warning, he reached out and slapped me across the cheek, hard. The sting was immediate, and I stumbled back, too shocked to cry. My dad was already running towards us, barreling through the snow in his boots. The man turned and bolted, disappearing into the whiteout conditions of the blizzard. My dad tried to chase him, but the snow was so deep, and the visibility was terrible. After a few minutes, he came back, breathing hard and swearing under his breath. He scooped me up, carried me inside, and checked my face. I was crying by then, more from the fear than the pain. My mom hugged me tightly while my dad called the police. The officers showed up about an hour later, but they couldn't do much. The man was long gone, and I hadn't seen enough of his face to give a good description. They told my parents to keep an eye out and to call if he showed up again. I wasn't allowed outside unsupervised after that. For the rest of the winter, my dad stayed with me whenever I played in the snow, even if it was just for a few minutes. That day stayed with me, though, not just because of what happened, but because of how close it came to being something so much worse. And I still think about it whenever I see a snowman. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if my dad hadn't been watching, if he hadn't yelled when he did. I'm just grateful I never had to find out. This happened when I was 10 years old, and to this day, it still makes my stomach twist every time I think about it. It was almost Christmas, and a huge snowstorm had rolled through our area. We lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind where nothing really happens, so snowstorms were more of an event than a concern. That night, the wind howled, and thick flakes blanketed everything outside. It was the kind of storm that was exciting as a kid, like magic. My parents, my older brother, and I spent the evening in the living room, eating popcorn and watching Christmas movies. The fireplace was going, the tree lights were glowing, and everything felt warm and cozy. Eventually, I must have dozed off on the couch, because the next thing I remember was waking up, and the room was dark. The TV was off, and the fire had burned down to embers, and I was completely alone. My parents must have gone to bed, assuming I'd wake up and head upstairs on my own. And at first, I wasn't scared. It was still cozy in a way, even with the snowstorm raging outside. But then I noticed something. It was freezing. The kind of cold that makes your skin prickle. I pulled my blanket tighter around me, thinking maybe the fire died down too much, but it didn't feel right. The air was too sharp. That's when I noticed it. Our back kitchen door, the one that led to the deck, was open. Not wide open, but cracked enough that snowflakes were drifting in and forming a small pile by the doorframe. I could hear the wind whistling through the gap. At first I thought maybe my dad hadn't latched it all the way earlier, but we were pretty good about things like that. Still, I figured it was no big deal. I just shut it and go upstairs. Dragging my blanket around my shoulders, I got up and walked toward the kitchen. My socks slid a little on the hard floor as I approached the door. As I reached out to grab the handle, something outside caught my eye. There was a man standing at the far end of our deck. I froze. He was just standing there, maybe 15 feet away, facing me. He wasn't bundled up like you'd expect in a storm like that. He was wearing a dark red t-shirt and a pair of ripped jeans, completely inappropriate for the weather. Snow was whipping around him, sticking to his hair and clothes, but he didn't seem to care. He wasn't moving, just standing there with a cigarette in his hand. I don't even think I breathed. My chest felt tight, and my legs would not move. The only thing I could do was stare at him, hoping I was imagining it. But then he spoke. "Word of advice," he said, his voice calm but chilling. "Next time, make sure all your doors are locked. Next time, you won't be so lucky." And I couldn't tell if I was more terrified by his words, or the fact that he said them like he was giving me friendly advice. He took one last drag of his cigarette, flicked it into the snow, and then just walked away. Not hurriedly, not even looking back. He stepped off the deck and disappeared into the blizzard. The second he was out of sight, I slammed the door shut, locked it, and ran upstairs as fast as I could. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I woke up my dad, practically shaking him as I told him what happened. And at first, I don't think he believed me, but when he went downstairs, there were footprints in the snow, leading up to the door and off into the yard. They weren't fresh anymore, but they were there. My dad checked every door and window in the house that night, making sure they were locked. We never found out who that man was or why he was there. It still doesn't make any sense. Why would someone be out in a storm like that, dressed like that? All I know is, from that night on, we never left a door unlocked. And it's been years, but sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I'll look out the window and see someone standing there, watching me. A few years back, I was dating this girl from my neighborhood, and I'm sharing this here because it's something I can't really talk about to most people without feeling like it's too much. And it happened during one of the worst blizzards our county had seen in decades, and everything was completely buried. Roads were impassable, cars were stuck in the driveways, and being on the edge of town, our neighborhood was pretty much last on the snowplow list. And I was bored out of my mind, and since I wasn't going anywhere anytime soon, I decided I'd surprise my girlfriend by walking to her house. I hadn't told her I was coming, and honestly, I was looking forward to seeing her reaction when I showed up with the snow still falling like crazy outside. The walk was brutal, freezing, windy, and I could barely see more than a few feet ahead of me. By the time I got to her house, I was soaked and freezing. That's when I noticed something odd. Her older brother's car was parked in the driveway. Now, this guy never came around. He had a reputation for being a little off. He had some serious mental health issues that made him isolate himself from his family. I never personally had a problem with him though, and I wasn't going to let it ruin my little surprise. I walked up to the door and knocked. Nothing. The snow and wind were howling, so I figured they probably did not hear me. I knocked harder. Still nothing. That's when I noticed the door wasn't fully latched. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The house was warm, the heat blasting, and every light was on. It did not seem like anyone was home, though. I called out my girlfriend's name a few times, but there was no response. That's when I figured they might be in the basement. It was a pretty cozy spot. They fixed it up with a couch, a TV, and a bunch of her family stuff. It was where she and her parents usually hung out on cold days like this. I made my way to the basement door and opened it. The stairs creaked as I headed downstairs. And at the bottom, I stopped dead in my tracks. The second I looked up, my stomach dropped, and I felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. Her brother was hanging from the ceiling. He tied a thick rope around one of the wooden beams that ran across the basement ceiling. His face was pale, his eyes half opened, and his body swayed just slightly, as if the air from the furnace had stirred it. The smell hit me next, a mix of sweat and something I can only describe as decay. My legs locked up, and for what felt like forever, I couldn't move. Eventually, my fight or flight kicked in, and I bolted back upstairs. My heart was pounding, and I did not even bother closing the basement door. I stumbled out into the snow, my mind racing. I could not believe what I'd just seen. Once I was a safe distance from the house, I pulled out my phone and called my girlfriend. She answered right away, laughing with her family in the background. They were out ice skating at the pond down the road. I couldn't even form a sentence at first. When I finally told her what I found, the phone went silent. She did not say anything for a long time, and when she finally spoke, it was just a quiet, shaky, "Okay, we'll head home." The aftermath was brutal. Her brother had been struggling for years, and this was a breaking point. The grief tore her family apart. It changed her too. We tried to stay together, but the weight of everything was too much. She couldn't look at me without being reminded of that day. Eventually, she ended things, and honestly, I don't blame her. That day still haunts me. Every time it snows heavily, I think about walking into that house, stepping into the basement, and seeing something no one should ever have to see. It's the kind of memory that sticks with you forever. My wife and I recently moved to the Northeast after living in Florida our whole lives. We wanted a fresh start, and when we found this beautiful old house in a quiet neighborhood, we couldn't resist. It was everything we dreamed of. Big windows, lots of character, and space to grow. The move was smooth, and we bought all new furniture to make it truly ours. It felt like the perfect place to settle down. One thing we weren't prepared for, though, was the weather. Florida winters were basically a slightly cooler version of summer. Here, snowstorms are no joke. The first real storm hit a couple of weeks after we moved in. It started in the afternoon, and by nightfall, we were completely snowed in. The roads were caked with snow, and the wind was howling like I never heard before. It was cozy at first. We had a fire going, hot chocolate, and a deck of Uno cards to pass the time. Around 9 p.m., as we were deep into a competitive game that I was losing badly, I heard a knock at the door. My wife and I both froze and stared at each other. It was weird. Who would be outside in a blizzard? I figured it had to be the wind or maybe snow falling off the roof. I got up to check. When I opened the door, there was nothing. Just snow swirling in the wind, piling up on our front porch steps. I shut the door, feeling a little uneasy, but I did not want to freak my wife out. Must have been the storm, I said casually, and went back to the Uno game. Not even 5 minutes later, there was another knock, louder this time. It was not the storm, I knew that much. My wife looked at me, her face pale, and I tried to brush it off. Probably a branch hitting the house, I said, though I did not really believe that. I got up again, feeling my stomach tightened as I walked to the door. When I opened it this time, there was a man standing on the steps. He did not look dressed for the weather. No coat, no gloves, just jeans and a hoodie. His hair was wet with snow, and his face was blank. No expression at all, like he was staring through me. I was startled, but managed to ask, "Can I help you?" He didn't say anything, just stood there, looking at me with those dead eyes. I waved my hand in front of his face, and still, nothing. My chest was pounding. "Hey, you okay? Do you need something?" That's when he finally spoke. In a flat, emotionless voice, he said, "I shall bury both you and your wife alive before this snowstorm is over." My heart dropped. I took a step back, and before I could respond, he turned and ran. Not walked, ran down the street into the blizzard. Within seconds, he was gone, swallowed by the storm. I slammed the door shut and locked it. My wife came over, panicked, and I told her what he said. She wanted to call the cops, but I wasn't sure what they could do. It's not like they could get to us with the roads in that condition. I checked every lock in the house, grabbed my gun, and kept it close. The rest of the night was tense. We sat in the living room with the fire going, trying to pretend everything was fine. Every little noise made us jump. I stayed up all night, waiting for the guy to come back, but he didn't. When the storm cleared a few days later, I kept an eye out for him, but he never showed up again. We even told our neighbors about it, but nobody recognized the description. I don't know if he was some kind of lunatic, a drunk, or something worse, but the way he spoke, the certainty in his voice, still haunts me. We've been here for a few months now, and nothing like that has happened again. But every time it snows, I can't help but think about his words. And if he was serious, or if it was just some sick joke, I don't know. Either way, I'll never forget that night. I'll never forget this. It's been years, but I still think about it every winter, especially during bad storms. When I was around 10, there was a night when a brutal snowstorm hit. The wind was howling so loud it woke me up. My room was dimly lit because I'd fallen asleep with the TV on, its bluish glow bouncing off the walls. I groggily reached for the remote to turn it off, but the stupid thing wasn't working. Annoyed, I threw the remote on the bed, got up, and walked over to the TV to turn it off manually. My TV was positioned right under my window, which overlooked our backyard. When I turned the TV off, my room went pitch black, and my eyes started to adjust to the darkness. That's when I glanced out the window and froze. By our shed, barely visible through the heavy snow, was a figure. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And at first I thought it might be my dad. Maybe he'd gone out to check on something. But it was past 2 a.m., and the wind and snow were brutal. There was no way he'd be outside in that weather. The figure wasn't moving. They just stood there, facing my house, facing me. And as my eyes adjusted more, I realized they were staring right at my window, right at me. A chill ran through me, and I instinctively ducked down, out of sight. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I'd pass out. For a second, I convinced myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was a shadow, or something blowing around in the storm. Gathering what little courage I had, I slowly peeked out the window again. The figure was gone. Relief washed over me, but it didn't last. When I looked closer, I realized the figure hadn't disappeared. They'd moved. Now they were standing at the bottom of our back porch steps. My stomach dropped. They were closer to the house, closer to me. And I ducked down again, hand shaking. I did not want to look anymore. I wanted to scream for my parents, but I was frozen. terrified that whoever or whatever was outside would hear me. After what felt like an eternity, I worked up the courage to peek out again. This time the porch was empty. I let out a shaky breath and tried to calm myself. Maybe I was seeing things. Maybe the storm was messing with my eyes. I was starting to convince myself it was all in my head when the doorbell rang. The sound jolted me so badly that I almost fell over. My stomach turned to ice. It wasn't a casual doorbell ring. It was frantic, like whoever was out there wanted to be let in immediately. I sat there, paralyzed, listening. I heard my dad grumble from his bedroom and then the creak of his footsteps on the stairs. "Who the hell is ringing the doorbell at this hour?" he muttered, loud enough for me to hear. I stayed glued to my spot, heart pounding. From my room, I heard him unlock and open the door. "Hello," he called, his voice cutting through the storm. No response. After a few seconds, he slammed the door shut and locked it. I mustered up the courage to run downstairs and found him standing in the entryway, looking pissed. "There's no one there," he said, rubbing his temples. "Dad," I whispered, "I saw someone outside earlier, by the shed, and then by the porch." He stared at me, his irritation fading into concern. Without a word, he grabbed a flashlight, threw on his coat, and headed out to check. I waited by the door, terrified he wouldn't come back. After about 5 minutes, he came inside, brushing snow off his jacket. "There's no one out there," he said. "No footprints, nothing." I wanted to believe him, but I knew what I saw. He must have seen how scared I was because he let me sleep in his room that night. I didn't sleep much, though. I couldn't stop thinking about the man outside, how he'd moved closer to the house, how he rung the doorbell, and how there was no sign of him when my dad looked. To this day, I have no idea who or what I saw that night, but I've never been able to shake the feeling that if my dad hadn't answered the door, the man would have tried to come inside. I'll never forget that day. It was the first snow day of the year, my junior year of high school. My mom woke me up way earlier than I would have liked, but when she said the words, "No school today, snow day," it was like Christmas morning. I'd already planned to sleep in, but the news gave me a second wind. By 9 a.m., I was bundled up and texting the group chat. It didn't take long for me and two of my neighborhood friends, Danny and Marcus, to agree on plans. Danny had this steep hill in his backyard that we've been dying to snowboard down since the first snowfall. It wasn't anything massive, but for suburban kids, it was perfect. By 10 a.m., we were at Danny's house, lugging our cheap snowboards to the backyard. The snow was pristine, untouched except for a few rabbit tracks. The air was freezing, but none of us cared. We took turns bombing down the hill, laughing every time someone wiped out. I'll admit, I wasn't the best at it, but none of us were. That wasn't the point. Things took a turn around our 5th or 6th run. Marcus was up next. He launched himself down the hill, gaining speed, when he hit this bump halfway down. The snowboard flew out from under him, and he landed hard, flipping onto his back. We all rushed down, half concerned but still kind of laughing, until we got closer. Marcus sat up, groaning, pointing at the bump he'd hit. "Dude, what even is that?" he said, brushing off snow. I crouched down and started brushing it aside with my gloved hands. At first I thought it was just a rock or a chunk of frozen dirt, but as more snow came off, I noticed it was something different, dark. The texture was all wrong, soft like fabric. "Guys, this isn't a rock," I said. My voice sounded weird, even to me. Danny and Marcus knelt next to me, helping me clear the snow. A shape started to emerge. First, there was a patch of something that looked like a jacket, then a sleeve, and then a hand. We all froze. Nobody said anything for what felt like forever. My brain was scrambling to make sense of it. Maybe it was a mannequin or some weird prank. But deep down, I already knew. It's a person, Marcus whispered, and I swallowed hard and brushed more snow away from what we now knew was a body. The face was mostly covered, but enough was visible to see that it was a man. His skin was grayish blue, his eyes shut. I pulled back, shaking. "What do we do?" Danny asked. "We tell someone," I said. My heart was pounding, and I felt like I might throw up. The three of us bolted back to Danny's house, snow crunching under our boots like thunder. His mom answered the door, and we spilled out the story so fast she barely understood us. When she did, her face went pale. She called the police right away. The next few hours were a blur. Cops showed up and asked us questions and taped off the area. Eventually, they told us the man was in his mid-40s. He'd been drinking, wandered into the yard, and passed out before the snowstorm hit. He froze to death overnight, and it was the most horrifying thing I'd ever seen. Seeing a dead body isn't like what it looks in the movies or TV. It's not clean or sanitized. It sticks with you, even when you close your eyes. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep without picturing his face, half covered in snow, frozen in place. That snow day changed me forever. It was supposed to be fun, carefree. Instead, it became a memory I'll carry for the rest of my life. Every winter, when the first snow falls, I think about that man, who he was and what led him to that hill, and if anyone missed him, I don't think I'll forget him or that day. I've always loved the outdoors. My two best friends, Eric and Dan, share the same passion. So when we had a chance to rent out a secluded cabin in the mountains of Pennsylvania for a weekend, we jumped on it. We figured it'd be a perfect escape from the usual grind, especially since a massive snowstorm was in the forecast. We weren't worried. We had snowmobiles, skis, and enough food and booze to last us days. The first day was amazing. We spent hours outside, playing in the snow like kids, riding the snowmobiles through the trails, and just soaking in the quiet isolation of the mountains. By the time the sun set, the storm had intensified, but inside we were warm and cozy. We got a fire going in the stone fireplace, put on some random horror movie in the background, and started taking shots. It felt perfect. That's when I got the first text. It was from a number I did not recognize. The message said, "Change the channel." I thought it was weird, but figured it was a wrong number or one of those spam messages. I showed it to Eric and Dan, and we all laughed it off. Dan even joked, maybe it's a ghost who hates horror movies. We brushed it off and kept drinking. A few minutes later, another text came through. Answered the door. I'll admit, that one sent a shiver down my spine. I showed the guys again, and they got quiet. This wasn't funny anymore. As we were trying to figure out what to make of it, there was a knock at the door. Let me paint the scene here. We were in the middle of nowhere. The snowstorm was coming down hard. No one else was supposed to be anywhere near us. The idea of someone being outside, in those conditions, in the middle of the night, was insane. We all froze for a second. Then Eric muttered, "What the hell?" Dan grabbed the fire poker. Eric picked up a heavy flashlight, and I grabbed a kitchen knife. We approached the door cautiously, whispering about what to do. I peeked through the window next to the door, but I couldn't see anyone. Finally, I worked up the nerve to open it. Slowly. No one was there, but there were footprints. Clear, fresh prints in the snow, leading up to the door and then back down the steps. The tracks disappeared into the darkness beyond the porch light's reach. We locked the door immediately. I tried calling the number that had texted me, but but it rang once and then went to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. At this point, we were on edge, debating whether this was some elaborate prank or if someone was genuinely messing with us. Either way, it was terrifying. We decided to stay in the living room, where we could keep an eye on the door and the windows. We turned off the horror movie because, honestly, it was making things worse. And every sound outside, the wind howling, tree branches cracking under the weight of the snow, felt amplified. We didn't sleep, not even for a minute. We sat there in silence, gripping our makeshift weapons, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. No more knocks, no more texts, no sign of anyone outside. By morning, the storm had eased up. In the daylight, we could see the tracks more clearly. They came from the woods, went straight to our door, then turned around and disappeared back into the trees. We followed them for a bit on the snowmobiles, but they eventually vanished where the snow had blown over. We stayed for 2 more nights, but we were all on edge the entire time. We kept the door locked and triple-checked every window before going to bed. I never got another text, and we did not see or hear anything unusual after that first night. Even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there, watching us. And I've told myself it was just some random prank or weird coincidence, but part of me wonders if we narrowly avoided something far worse. Needless to say, I won't be renting any more cabins in the middle of nowhere anytime soon. Hey, what's up guys? It's Spooky. If you've made it this far, congratulations, you survived. If you did not know, I have an Instagram. Follow me on there so we can connect. I also have a Patreon. On there, you'll have direct access to me and can see the upcoming videos, polls, and soon-to-be exclusive stories only shared on there. If that's something that interests you, please consider joining. That's all I have for you guys tonight. Stay spooky, and I'll see you in the next video.